Genesis, we're going to finish up Genesis 32. We're ready for verse 22 in Genesis 32. We're in the process of getting Esau and Jacob to meet, and there's a story that when you look at it, you wonder why it's here, and yet when you think about it, you make some application. It's really a neat story. It's as we see with regards to Jacob wrestling with God. Let's just review for just a second, if you don't mind. We have Jacob and Esau. We have the story of Jacob and Esau. And of course, Esau was the firstborn or secondborn? First. Esau was the firstborn. Jacob was the second. With that, though, as the boys grew up, Esau did what? He sold his what? Sold his birthright. Sold, thus, really his rightful claim as the, for lack of a better term, majority heir of the family's estate. And so, from that then came a scheme by Jacob and Esau's mother. Who was their mother? Who? Excuse me. Don't know where that came from. So, came from Bo. Yeah. I have had drainage for, let's see, how old am I? 60? 50 years. Yeah. And so, anyway, so Jacob and Esau, so Jacob then came up with a scheme. He and his mother came up with a scheme, and they got Isaac to bless him. And from that, then, that event, we have Esau then, at least more kill his brother probably. And his brother Jacob decides to go off. And Jacob goes off, and he goes off for about 20 years. Who does he work for? Laban. And there he, of course, as we have already revealed in our study of Genesis, Laban kind of messes with him, if you will. The great trickster ends up being tricked in Jacob. And so Laban gets 20 years of work out of him. Jacob, as the story goes, and if you think about the story, you think about how Moses is revealing this by inspiration. Now, as we will see, if not this week, next week, probably this week, we will see Jacob become, what's his next name? What's his new name? God's going to give him Israel. And that's who we think of, and we just think of Israel. We don't often think of Jacob. But Jacob will become Israel, renamed by God. Now, that's why Moses, if you will, in telling the story, went and followed Jacob and not so much Esau. But Jacob has decided to come home. And as he comes home, of course, he's going to meet Esau, and there's going to be some things that happen. And we looked at some of that was found in chapter 32 last week. But now there's something that happens with regards to Jacob that is an interesting story. Let's begin. Genesis 32:22. He arose that night, took his two wives, Rachel and Leah, his two female servants, his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." Now, we see this, if you will, this angel that touches Jacob, and his hip's out of socket. But before that happens, they have wrestled all night. This is this is really, if you stop and think about it, and we'll see this play out in the rest of the chapter, but this is the humbling of Jacob. Now, just hold that thought, if you will, for just a minute, and let's go back to the story. Verse 26, we'll pick up there. He said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he holds on wanting a blessing. And he said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "You're no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." And Jacob asked, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, which means face of God. "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." It's preserved, really, it's preserved as the favored person. Instead of the book of Judges, you find that a little bit more explained, I guess, a little bit better. Just as he crossed over Peniel, Peniel also means face of God, the sun rose on him and he limped on his hip. Now, how long he limped? How long did he skip along? I don't know. Bible doesn't tell us. But he limped for a while. Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat muscle of the shrink, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the muscle that shrank. We look at this story and we say, okay, the angel Lord comes to Jacob by night. They wrestle all night. Jacob wants a blessing from him. He changes his name, of course, to Israel. But they wrestle all night. And we sit there and we wonder, or I wonder, number one, why this happened. Number two, why Moses, by inspiration, gave it to us. Consequently, wondering why God thought we needed it. Now, that's sort of maybe the preacher within me, but that's the process that I go through in thinking about all that. And then when you think about it, you think about, okay, the exact meaning, the exact reason is not explained or told out. But when you get a sense of the rest of the Bible, one of the things you find out is that one of the things that's used upon us to get our attention is what? Pain, conflict, trouble. And if we apply it correctly, what does it do to us? Humbles us, makes us stop to think, and draws us back to God, right? Isn't that what Hebrews chapter 12 is not all about, but isn't that what, at least the first 11 verses of the book of Hebrews, isn't that what he's talking about? Especially, you might even say verses 5 through 11, where he talks about no chastening, no discipline, seems to be joyous, but grievous, but afterwards it works the peaceable fruits of righteousness. No one enjoys the idea of pain. No one enjoys the idea of trouble. When I think of those, then in my mind, I immediately go back to Paul's thorn in the flesh of 2 Corinthians 12. Paul said, "Lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelation." In other words, Paul says, unless I get the big head, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, problems. I go back to Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet of God, which really, all he really wanted to do was let folks know about God. Because he talked about the fire that burned within him in Jeremiah 6. And yet, laughed at, thrown in a pit, all kinds of other problems. And you go through and you look at the Bible and you see folks that had problems, difficulties, heartaches, hurts, life's pains, life's agonies. Yes, some more than others. And why? We cannot explain that. I can't explain it. The Bible really doesn't give us a reason. But it does tell us that we can let it do one of two things. We can let it soften us, or we can let it make us hard. I was talking to a fellow, good friend of mine, just a couple of weeks ago. And he's having some things going on in his life that's pretty tough. And I told him, I said, okay, here's what you can do. And reality of it is you can get mad and you can lash out at people and you can create problems that way. Or you can take it and move forward. May not like it, but take it and move forward. I don't know any of us that have enjoyed the problems of pain. Don't think Paul enjoyed his thorn in the flesh. And then if you're looking at Paul's thorn in the flesh, 2 Corinthians 12, go back to 2 Corinthians 11, where he talks about all the things he went through. Why did Jacob suffer this? I don't know, but I do know that it was God's way of getting his attention. Because it seems to me, maybe I read too much into it, but as we get into the next chapter or two, he's still limping for a while. And then the reminder, because they wouldn't eat certain of the meat around the bone there. Why? Because God or the angel had put his hip out of socket. Is the fact that we should all be reminded. And our problems are really there to remind us, to get our attention, to remind us. And so it's sort of like, go back to the illustration that I used of the guy that I talked to. It's sort of like the old illustration of putting an egg in boiling water and putting a potato in the boiling water. Potato gets soft, the egg gets hard, right? And so you have a choice. And Jacob had a choice. But I think God is using this to get his attention. So there are times when we all wrestle with God, right? You ever wrestled with God? Because maybe things you realized in life that things were gonna work their way through because God's with you, but you didn't like the direction that it was going. You didn't like the time that it took. Whatever the case may be, I think, if it's not true in your life, it probably will become true. It's been true in my life. I'll put it like that. And so we have to understand that we may limp in life. But I'm reminded, you've heard me tell a story of a guy by the name of Charles Glasscock, and I'll just remind you of the story. I'll tell it quickly since I've told it before. Charles, when I met him, had suffered a stroke. It had affected his hearing, and it had definitely affected his speech. And Charles, as I was sitting in his living room one day, he told me, he said, if this is what it took for God to get my attention, it worked. But I'm thankful for it, and I'm able to live with it. And I've often thought of that when I go through whatever I go through, And so we should too. And I think that, you wonder, and I don't, what I'm about to say, I don't have the answer to, but you wonder how many times in his life from this point forward, Jacob looked back and said, he remembered that night of wrestling with the angel. And the humbling, if you will, that it affected. Anything else? Anything along that line? All right, well, Jacob and Esau meet. Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming. With him were 400 men. Esau came loaded for bear, because why? He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know how Jacob was going to react. And so he brought 400 men, and he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. Now, it's interesting how he's going to spread everybody out. He put the maidservants and their children in front. For him, he considered those expendable. Right? How many? I don't give me a show of hands because this might be embarrassing, but I've heard of folks that in families the children ate last. Say like when all the family got together, the children ate last. Now that was not true in the family I grew up in. The children and the men ate first, and that was to get us out of the way of the wonderful cooks that we had in our family. But there were some families that talked about, well, the children went last. There was, that was just the way that they did it. There seems to be of little value, or maybe, the fact that, well, the children, we'll let them go first, the maids. If something happens, if Esau does anything, he's probably going to do it to the first and work his way back. And so we put them first. And so he put those first, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. Any favoritism? I see it already. Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his house. There is a discussion over why he bowed in scholarly circles, and I don't have the definitive answer. Some said that it was a sign of submission, that he was acknowledging and being a servant then to his brother. It was also, however, a way of greeting people, that you just bowed. It was not necessarily a submission from a standpoint of a servant, his master, but just a way of greeting. So then we get to the point, well, why 7 times? Well, we could say, well, 7 in biblical times was perfect. Well, yeah, but that's a little bit later on. It could have been at this point in time. Exactly why he bowed, we do not know. It seems to be as if maybe it was a greeting, but it was also to show, okay, this is a warm greeting. I'm not coming in defiance of you. Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, kissed him, and they wept. Did it remind you of anything in the New Testament? Prodigal son, yeah. Reminds you a lot of the prodigal son. So Esau really demonstrated brotherly love. He lifted his eyes and saw the women, and children, and said, "Who are these with you?" Now, these are kinfolk that he would have known nothing about, right? Because when when Jacob left by himself, right? Comes back, he's got wives, he's got handmaids, he's got children. Who are all these folks? So he said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maidservants came near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah also came near with her children. They bowed down. Afterward, Joseph and Rachel came near, and they bowed down. Then Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company which I met?" And he said, "These are to find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." We talked a little bit about this last week. A gift brought in order to appease any anger. A gift brought in order to show kindness. A gift brought in order to kind of smooth things over. But Esau said, I don't need anything. I don't need anything. Now, there's a danger in that as well if you stop and think about it. What's that? He's flaunting his wealth. But Esau could have taken it that way. There's always a danger. Because there's always a danger in just about anything you do. Have you ever thought about that? I'm sure you have. But the reason is because we don't know how people think. I was just thinking this morning of an instance because I was thinking of a lady, and a very fine lady, a very good lady. But I was thinking of an instance that happened several years ago. I was teaching a Bible class, and somebody asked a question, and I answered the question. I answered it in a very loving, kind way, or at least for me, what I thought was a very loving and kind way. I answered it as to show and to throw upon individuals compassion. for their decisions that they had made. That was on Sunday morning, Bible class. On Sunday night, she called me into my office, and she and her husband sat there, and for about 10 minutes, she read me the riot act. I mean, it was not pleasant. And I was looking back over it, like I say, again this morning, I was thinking about it, and I thought, I really didn't mean anything ugly by what I said. I answered a question. Matter of fact, when, a couple of others heard about it, they asked some folks that were in the class about it, because they reported back then to me. And they said, all he was doing was answering a question, and he did it in a very fine way. But the truth is, when you dissected the layers of it, she had taken it completely different than what I had intended. But then when I got to looking at it a little bit deeper, there was a background there that I did know about, but didn't think about when I answered the question. We don't know what's going on in people's lives and what's turning in their heads. And so even the most innocent of acts, the most loving of acts, the most kind acts can sometimes be misconstrued. Well, Jacob brings all this to Esau. And Esau says, I don't need it. So Jacob said, no, please. If I found favor in your sight, then receive my present from my hand, inasmuch as I have seen your face as though I have seen the face of God. And you were pleased with me. Please take my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough. So he urged him and he took it. Enough urging and he takes it. So he pleads. Esau said, let us take our journey. Let us go, and I'll go before you. Jacob said to him, my Lord knows children are weak. The flocks and herds they're nursing are with me, and if the men should drive them hard one day, all the flock will die. Please let my Lord go on ahead before his servant. I'll lead on slowly at a pace which livestock that go before me and the children are able to endure, until I come to my Lord in Seir. So he reveals his plans. I'm coming, and I'll come on. And Esau said, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor at the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth, built himself a house, made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of the place is called Succoth. Now, notice what's said here. Notice what Jacob does. Jacob journeys a distance away, but he built a house. Now, the question is, if you look at this, and then if you look at the Hebrew, we really don't get a definitive answer. This house could have been a more permanent dwelling, but it could have also, the Hebrew word can also have the idea of a less permanent dwelling place, more like a tent. The word booths there that is found in verse 17 is more like a tent. You've heard of the Feast of Booths. These are temporary dwellings. They're more like what we would think of lean-tos. They are shelter from the rain, if you have any, shelter from the sun of the day, shelter at night, but they're just temporary. There are those that look at the idea of Jacob building a house and say, well, he meant to stay, and he meant to stay for a while. But there are those that look at it and say, well, since we can't be sure of the Hebrew word for house, and it is true that what he made for his livestock is tents or temporary shelter, that he built just a place for his wife or for his, the children, for the people, I guess you could say, and then he built a place for the livestock. But notice the name of the place, Succoth. That's going to be important. a little later on. Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Paddan Aram, and he pitched his tent before the city. And he bought the parcel of land which he'd pitched his tent from the city of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Then he erected an altar there and called it El Eloi Israel. Now this is the interesting part. He called the name of the place God, El, God, and then Elohe Israel, the God of Israel. God, the God of Israel. So he built an altar, and he named it after himself, so to speak. But he named God as being his God. And so in naming the place, he gives insight into his relationship with God. He gives insight into his relationship with how he feels about himself. And so he erects this altar as he's come to Canaan as being the place of God. Not a lot there to apply, just a fact. And I think that's why probably Moses revealed it. Anything else? Anything in that chapter that you want to talk about? Not a lot there. All right, well, let's get into the 34th chapter. Dinah, the daughter of Leah. This is one of those terrible stories. It's one of those stories that you go, man, I just didn't have to know that. But God thinks that we do. And sadly, nothing good seemingly comes out of this story in many ways. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. He raped her. No easy term, no easy way to put this. An act which is condemned by God. An act which shouldn't have been committed. The age of Dinah is what we often wonder. And once again, the Hebrew doesn't help us, and you can look, and I looked in several different places. Some referred to her as a teenager. Some referred to her as a young teenager. I was looking again last night. One guy that I was looking at last night made the reference that she was older, that she was more like in her 20s or 30s. And so we're not certain of her age. And to be honest, it doesn't matter. She was violated, and she shouldn't have been. Verse 3 is interesting, not from the standpoint of it's kind of sad to say, but his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. He fell in love with her. Strange event. It happened at this point in time. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Give me this young woman as wife." Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. Jacob shows restraint. Jacob doesn't call out for his sons. The shepherds were known to go to carry the sheep out and carry them out for several days. Carry them out for several days, let them graze, let them fatten up a little bit, let them get some strength, let them get what they need, and then bring them back in for a while. And so Jacob just decides to hold his peace and let his boys come back in a little later. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it. The men were grieved and very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing that ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as wife, and make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourselves. So now all of a sudden, let's just, our folks and your folks. It goes from, sad to say it goes from one man violating a woman, which he, like I say, he shouldn't have done, to saying, okay, I'm in love with her, I want her for a wife, to all of a sudden going to Daddy, say, Daddy, you need to fix this. To Daddy going then to the other daddy, if you will, and saying, okay, hey, how about, your folks get with my folks, and let's sort of make it, just smooth it all over, if you will. Well, let's see what happens. Verse 10, so you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it. Then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I'll give. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me. But give me the young woman as a wife. We often think of dowries as being what the woman would have to give to the man, to his family. But in Old Testament times, especially early Old Testament times, it was, how much can I give to you, to the father, for this wife? And I'm sure, there have been some guys that crack jokes and say, well, I took her because my father-in-law gave me this. Now, I'll tell you what, my father-in-law gave me nothing but grief. So I guess he was saying because she was a good one. And but Shechem says, hey, how much? How much? But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, and spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. And they said to him, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition, we will consent to you if you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised. Now there's really a plan behind this. But they want all the males to be circumcised. Now, you can only imagine. And so they said, verse 16, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughters and be gone. Now, I want you to draw a parallel which may not be what you would think of when you read this story, and it may not even be fair to the text. But it is, if you will, a street that I want to travel for just a second to give us pause to think. Basically, the children of Jacob, the sons of Jacob, said, be circumcised, become like us. And then we will go together as families. There's a good application here from the standpoint of Christians and the church today. And that is, you can't compromise the truth to fit something wherein you might gain. You might say, what in the world are you talking about? A couple of Wednesday nights ago, we talked about really the state of the church. And the state of the church today, where we are and what it will be like in the future. And of course, we can only guess. We can't know. But in talking about that, one of the things that we talked about, how the church has changed. And there are things that change in the church that we do differently today than what was done 3 years ago. Passing out the Lord's Supper done differently. But think about, say, the church, and not just River Road, but think about other congregations and what we do now as opposed to what we did 50 years ago. Things have changed. And they were matters of opinion, and they really don't matter, and so they're really not hurting anything. But one of the things that we are beginning to see more of is a change in doctrine. Now, doctrine itself hasn't changed. We've tried to make doctrine change to fit us. We've compromised in the name of drawing more people in. Now, that's the reason for the compromise. Now, admittedly, we want to save everybody and we want everybody to go to heaven. But we can't compromise doctrine. Now, tonight we're going to talk about Acts 15, and we're going to talk about opinion and doctrine. So I'm going to try not to follow that avenue for just a minute. But I do want to say this, that in some ways here, you see, Israel is standing up and saying, you got to be like us. We're not going to be like you all. The church needs to stand up and say, this is how we need to be. And we realize that it's not going to be favorable for some. We realize that it's not going to be what you're going to agree with regards to some. I heard just not long ago of an individual that one of the family members had passed away, and one of the children hadn't spoken to this family member in quite a while. And the reason being because the family member that passed away was a preacher and was standing for the truth, and the daughter thought that father was all washed up and hadn't spoken to the father in quite a while, and now the father's died. And like I say, the whole reason was he wasn't willing to compromise truth. Well, you might say, well, circumcision, that was, if you will, that was the distinguishing mark between the two, between a Jewish person, an Israelite, if you will, and one that was not a follower of God. And so here's the point. We want you to become like us. We're not going to become like you. We're not going to be of the way of the world, of the idolatrous people. We're going to be people of God still. Anything anybody wants to say about that? Like I say, maybe I chased a rabbit you don't want to chase.
That's a great point, but really, I don't think that was their ulterior motive.
I think their ulterior motive is to... Yeah. I think their ulterior motive is to kill them. I think it's a ploy, if you will.
So they use religion as a doctrine.
Yeah, we were going to bring all that up, but yeah. I agree with you. I don't think that was it.
They weren't standing for the truth. And sometimes use doctrine against other people, put them down. Oh, we can't be like you.
That's right.
Because in their eyes, you're better than you are.
That's right. It's been used, absolutely.
That's what's sad sometimes.
Absolutely. Yes, and that has been used time and time again, sadly.
How much damage has been done by that versus the other? I think of all I've grown up in one church, but in the church all my life since I can remember, a lot of stuff has changed, and the people at the time, when it was the other way, was insistent upon we got to stand our ground and all that. But then looking back, wearing shorts to church camp don't seem like that big a deal. But there was 2 or 3 years we had to wear blue jeans down on the Lake Barclay, and it was about 95 degrees and 95% humidity. Looking back now, understanding more about the gospel, and who came up with that?
Well, that's the years I would have taught on wandering through the wilderness.
Or, I remember
Sorry.
about these flower pins in the window, and once somebody got to reach on the church, and it was this huge big deal. And so maybe you should give us a couple of sermons on what doctrine really is.
Yeah.
Loves Jesus, Savior.
Yeah.
Can't work your way to heaven, some of those things. Those are the basic things, but we got this idea we're going to try draw the line on these other things that, I don't know why we do that, really. And I think it's dangerous. It might be why there's 25 people sitting in here instead of 125.
Yes and no. Yeah. Yeah, Billy.
I'm glad you brought it up. I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's, I still believe, and I said it before I started, I think this is a ploy to kill them. Yeah, because, you used to wait till the 8th day. In Old Testament times, you wait till the 8th day because vitamin K is the highest at that point in time, the clotting agent in the human system. And but this is nothing more than to get them where they can't fight back, I think. But yeah, with regards to the church, we have beat people over the head with things. About 18 years ago, I was getting the oil changed in my car, and I was sitting in the lobby, and I could hear the workers outside. It was a small place. This was in Dixon at the time. It's not there anymore. And anyway, I heard two young guys talking about it. One young guy was saying, I want to go to church, but I don't know where to go to church. Well, this other guy who admittedly said, well, I don't go to church. He had all the answers for all the churches. He said, don't go to Church of Christ because they're the only ones who think they're going to heaven. Well, it took all that was within me not to go back there and say, you need to be taught a few things. You need to be explained to you that we don't think we're the only ones going to heaven. We think we're ones that are trying to do what the Bible says. And if we believe if you do what the Bible says, that you'll get to heaven. God will take care of it. But I didn't. But I've noticed that there's a lack, there's not as much of that today as what there was, say, 15 years ago. You know why? In my opinion? I think that's part of it within the church. Without the church or those outside the church, it's because they don't care anymore. There's enough groups that will appease whatever they think. This has been several years ago, but one day I was driving through a part of Dixon where we didn't have any members, and we're not so far from Dixon. Y'all don't know how big Dixon is. Dixon's not that big, 15,000 people. But I was driving through just a residential section, and I found 4 churches that I didn't know existed. Little churches that they had built many years ago, but it was different beliefs, had different signs on it. And you can find a group with your part on it. Yes, I do believe within the church, why don't we practice church discipline like we're supposed to? Legal action. So, yeah. Anything else?
My little born and raised Baptist friend used to say we were full.
Yeah.
And then when my grandfather died, and she saw all the people that drove to Dixon for his funeral, and all the food that were brought, and all the kindness they showed her, I think she kind of changed her mind a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're not near as bad, but our bark at times, especially years ago, was worse than it should have been. Anything else?
We had a dear brother here, that he was a minister and had retired, and the church. There was a picture taken at church camp of the kids, and some of them had shorts, and they put it out there on the bulletin board, and he just near that stroke, that seriousness in the church, and
Yeah, there's.
I have to think the folks in the dress is appropriate dress. That's what should be worn.
Well, in many ways, years ago, we were no greater than the Pharisees who strained at a gnat to swallow a camel. But at the same time, too, I'm not willing to just throw what we did years ago out and say, oh, we were terrible, we were wrong. I think someone said, and correctly so, we were standing for what was right. And the way you approached people and things was different than the way you approach people and things today. Yeah. Yeah, in the debate, yeah, I believe we used that last week, yeah. Anything else? Well, we do see.
In the old way was okay. That person thought it was just terrible. I remember it. Person was supposed to say, oh, okay, we won't ever wear shorts again, or we're supposed to, It's like we need to decide what matters and what doesn't. How are we going to do that?
We'll begin that subject tonight on our sermon, Acts 15, opinion and doctrine. We won't answer it completely. Won't have time because of the way I'm developing the sermon. But there is that question. Doctrine is settled and opinion's not. And one of the things that any congregation of any size has is a difference of opinion on opinions. I'll give you a for instance, and y'all can all say amen. What temperature do you set the thermostat at in the church building? Depends on if it's the end of the month. 72. How many of you think it's warm in here today? How many of you think it's just right? How many of you are cool? Don't raise your hand, Pat.
What was the scheme that God made Adam and Eve? What did they do? What are you supposed to do?
Well, I think it goes even deeper than that today. Culture has a definitive edge on what is decent and indecent with regards to dress. So I mean, and what I mean by what I say is that what is considered, say, what might be considered immodest in, say, this part of the world, in other parts of the world, it's not. There are some parts of the world where they all, men and women, walk around without any clothes on. But that is the accept, and I'm not talking about nudists now. I'm talking about, third world countries. That is the accepted part of their society. And so you got to put that into the equation. But doctrine is established. Well, yeah, but I was trying to make a point, but yeah. Yeah, it's,
I found myself wanting to
take them in and bring them some clothes. Yeah. Yeah, always a problem. Anything else? I don't know. Anything else? All right. Well, Suzanne's let the animals out. I mean, the children out. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I apologize. Anyway, we will stop right there. Thank you all. Y'all have a great day.